Picture the American Wild West in your mind right now. You're probably seeing dusty main streets, swinging saloon doors, cowboys in 10-gallon hats having shootouts at high noon, and outlaws robbing stagecoaches while riding off into the sunset. Maybe there's a sheriff with a silver star, a beautiful saloon girl, and Native Americans attacking wagon trains. Here's the problem. Almost everything you just imagined is complete fiction. The Wild West, as portrayed in movies, TV shows, and popular culture, bears little resemblance to the actual American frontier of the 1800s. Today, we're going to shatter every Wild West myth you've ever believed. We'll explore what life was really like on the American frontier, how Hollywood transformed history into entertainment, and why these myths have had such a lasting impact on American identity and culture. The real American West was far more diverse, complex, and frankly, more interesting than any Hollywood movie has ever shown. It was a place where former slaves became successful cowboys, where women ran businesses and owned property, where different cultures mixed and clashed in ways that defy simple storytelling. But first, let's understand how we got these myths in the first place. The romanticization of the American West began almost immediately after the frontier period ended. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West shows, which toured America and Europe from the 1880s to 1910s, were among the first to present a dramatized, sanitized version of frontier life. These shows featured staged gunfights, mock Indian attacks, and displays of cowboy skills that were more entertainment than historical education. Audiences loved the spectacle, but they were watching carefully choreographed performances that emphasized action and adventure, while ignoring the mundane realities of frontier life. Early pulp fiction writers like Ned Buntline capitalized on this interest by creating exaggerated stories about real frontier figures. These dime novels transformed people like Wild Bill Hickok and Calamity Jane into larger-than-life characters, whose fictional adventures became more famous than their actual lives. When Hollywood emerged in the early 1900s, filmmakers inherited these romanticized stories and amplified them even further. Silent westerns like The Great Train Robbery, 1903, established visual and narrative conventions that would define the genre for over a century. Let's start with the most persistent Wild West myth: the idea that gunfights and violence were constant parts of frontier life. Hollywood westerns have conditioned us to expect shootouts in every scene, but the reality was dramatically different. Actual gun violence in Wild West towns was remarkably rare. Dodge City, Kansas, often called the most violent frontier town, averaged only 1.5 homicides per year during its peak cattle drive period. Compare that to modern American cities, and you'll find that many contemporary locations have higher murder rates than the supposedly lawless frontier.
Most frontier towns had strict gun control laws that would shock modern Americans.
Tombstone, Arizona, site of the famous gunfight at the OK Corral, had an ordinance requiring visitors to check their weapons with the sheriff upon entering town. Deadwood, South Dakota, had similar laws. Cowboys were typically required to leave their guns at the edge of town or store them at local businesses. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral lasted only about 30 seconds and was considered shocking precisely because gun violence was so unusual. The incident made national headlines specifically because it was such an extraordinary event, not because it was typical of frontier justice. Professional gunfighters, as portrayed in movies, essentially didn't exist. The men Hollywood transformed into legendary gunslingers were usually lawmen, gamblers, or criminals, whose reputations were built on isolated incidents rather than careers of constant violence. Wild Bill Hickok, often portrayed as the ultimate gunfighter, was actually a Union spy during the Civil War, a professional gambler, and briefly a lawman. His reputation for gun skills came primarily from a single incident where he killed Davis Tutt in a face-to-face shootout in Springfield, Missouri, an event so unusual it made newspapers across the country. The classic high noon showdown where two men face each other in the middle of a dusty street never happened in real life. This dramatic device was invented by Hollywood scriptwriters who needed a visually exciting way to resolve conflicts. Real gunfights, when they occurred, were usually brief, chaotic affairs that took place in saloons, alleys, or during the commission of other crimes. Frontier communities were actually quite law-abiding because survival depended on cooperation and mutual support. People couldn't afford to alienate their neighbors through violence or antisocial behavior. Most disputes were resolved through negotiation, legal proceedings, or social pressure rather than gunplay. The weapons commonly shown in westerns were also often historically inaccurate. The famous Colt .45 Peacemaker wasn't introduced until 1873, and was expensive enough that most cowboys couldn't afford one. Many frontier settlers used older, cheaper firearms or didn't own guns at all. Now let's tackle another major myth: the idea that the Wild West was populated exclusively by white cowboys and hostile Indians. The real demographic makeup of the American frontier was incredibly diverse in ways that Hollywood has largely ignored. Approximately 1 in 4 cowboys was African American. After the Civil War, many freed slaves moved west, seeking economic opportunities and freedom from Southern oppression. They became skilled cattle drivers, ranch hands, and even ranch owners. Some of the most respected cowboys in Texas and other cattle states were black men who had learned livestock handling skills during slavery. Bass Reeves, one of the most effective U.S. Marshals in frontier history, was a black man who arrested over 3,000 criminals during his career and was never wounded despite numerous dangerous encounters. His story would make an incredible movie, but Hollywood has largely ignored him in favor of fictional white heroes. Mexican vaqueros were the original cowboys who developed most of the techniques, equipment, and terminology that American cowboys later adopted. Words like lasso, rodeo, bronco, and mustang are Spanish in origin. Mexican ranchers had been managing cattle herds in the American Southwest for centuries before Anglo settlers arrived. Chinese immigrants made up significant portions of many Western towns' populations. They worked as miners, railroad builders, laundrymen, cooks, and shopkeepers. Chinese workers built much of the western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad under extremely dangerous conditions, but their contributions are rarely acknowledged in popular Western narratives. Native American tribes had complex relationships with frontier settlers that can't be reduced to the simple cowboy versus Indian conflicts shown in movies. Many tribes traded peacefully with settlers, served as guides and interpreters, and adapted to changing economic conditions by incorporating new technologies and practices. Women played far more active and independent roles on the frontier than Hollywood typically shows. They ran boarding houses, owned shops, practiced medicine, taught school, and managed farms and ranches. Some women dressed as men to work as cowboys or soldiers. The frontier offered women opportunities for independence that weren't available in more established Eastern communities. European immigrants from dozens of countries sought opportunities in the American West. German, Irish, Italian, Scandinavian, and other immigrant communities established towns, farms, and businesses throughout the frontier. Each group brought different skills, traditions, and perspectives that enriched frontier culture. Religious diversity was also much greater than Westerns suggest. While Protestant Christianity was common, frontier communities included Catholics, Jews, Mormons, and people with no religious affiliation. This diversity sometimes created tensions, but it also demonstrated the pluralistic nature of frontier society. The typical frontier town was more likely to resemble a multicultural trading post than the homogeneous white community shown in most Westerns. Let's examine what frontier towns actually looked like and how people really lived, because Hollywood's version bears little resemblance to historical reality. Most frontier towns weren't the dusty, ramshackle collections of wooden buildings with swinging saloon doors that we see in movies. Successful frontier communities were planned settlements with substantial buildings, established businesses, and social institutions like schools and churches. Saloons existed, but they served multiple functions beyond just selling alcohol. They were community centers where people gathered for meals, meetings, entertainment, and social interaction. Many saloons served as unofficial town halls, courthouses, and even churches when formal institutions weren't available. The idea that frontier towns were lawless is another Hollywood invention. Most communities established formal legal systems very quickly, because law and order were essential for economic development. Town councils, mayors, sheriffs, and courts were among the first institutions established in new settlements. Frontier economics were more complex than the cattle and mining focus of most Westerns. Agriculture was actually the dominant economic activity, with farmers growing crops ranging from wheat and corn to fruits and vegetables. Many towns supported diverse economies including manufacturing, commerce, and professional services. Women's roles were far more varied and important than Hollywood suggests. Pioneer women weren't just passive companions to male settlers, they were active partners in building communities. They established schools, organized churches, provided medical care, ran businesses, and sometimes served in official capacities like postmistress or telegraph operator. Family life on the frontier was central to community development. Most settlers came west as families seeking economic opportunities, not as individual adventurers looking for excitement. Children attended schools, played games, and participated in community activities, much like their counterparts in Eastern communities. Entertainment was important, but different from movie portrayals. Real frontier entertainment included community dances, church socials, traveling shows, amateur theatrical productions, and seasonal festivals. While some communities had gambling and prostitution, these activities were typically regulated and confined to specific areas. Architecture evolved quickly from temporary shelters to permanent structures. Early settlers might live in dugouts, sod houses, or log cabins, but successful communities soon featured substantial wooden or brick buildings that provided comfort and demonstrated prosperity. Transportation was crucial to frontier development. Stagecoach lines, freight wagons, and eventually railroads connected frontier communities to national markets and allowed for the movement of people, goods, and information. The romantic image of isolated frontier towns was largely fictional. Most successful settlements were part of extensive transportation networks. Technology adoption was often rapid on the frontier. Telegraph lines, modern agricultural equipment, and industrial machinery reached frontier communities surprisingly quickly, driven by the economic advantages these technologies provided. The portrayal of Native Americans in Hollywood westerns represents perhaps the most damaging and historically inaccurate aspect of Wild West mythology. The reality of Native American settler relations was far more complex, varied, and nuanced than the simplistic conflicts shown in movies. First, it's crucial to understand that there were hundreds of distinct Native American tribes, each with their own cultures, languages, political systems, and relationships with European American settlers. Hollywood typically portrayed all Native Americans as essentially identical, usually based on Plains Indian cultures, which represented only a small fraction of the indigenous peoples settlers encountered. Many Native American tribes had peaceful, even cooperative relationships with settlers. They served as guides, translators, and trading partners. Some tribes adapted to changing conditions by adopting European American agricultural practices, educational systems, and political structures while maintaining their cultural identities. The Cherokee Nation, for example, had developed a written constitution, newspaper, and formal government system modeled partly on American institutions. Many Cherokee were educated, prosperous farmers and businessmen who lived in frame houses and participated in the broader American economy. Conflicts between Native Americans and settlers, when they occurred, were usually about specific issues like land rights, treaty violations, or resource competition, rather than inherent racial animosity. Both sides committed acts of violence, but these were typically responses to specific grievances, rather than expressions of generalized warfare. The Indian Wars, as portrayed in Hollywood, were actually a series of separate conflicts spanning decades and involving different tribes, military units, and political contexts. Each conflict had its own causes, participants, and outcomes. Reducing this complex history to simple cowboys versus Indians narratives distorts the actual experiences of all involved. Many Native Americans served as scouts, interpreters, and allies for the U.S. military during various conflicts. Some tribes allied with the United States against other tribes, while some fought alongside settlers against common enemies. These alliances demonstrate the political complexity of frontier relations. The U.S. government's policies toward Native Americans were inconsistent and often contradictory, ranging from attempts at assimilation to forced relocation to military conquest. These policy changes created confusion and conflict that affected how individual encounters between Native Americans and settlers played out. Intermarriage between Native Americans and settlers was common, creating mixed-race communities that don't fit neatly into the racial categories that Hollywood westerns typically employ. These communities developed their own cultural practices and social structures that combined elements from different traditions. Trade relationships were often more important than military conflicts in shaping Native American settler interactions. Both groups needed goods and services that the other could provide, leading to complex economic relationships that continued even during periods of political tension. Let's explore how Hollywood created and perpetuated these Wild West myths, and why they became so deeply embedded in American culture that many people still believe them today. The transformation began with Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West shows in the late 1800s. Cody, a former scout and buffalo hunter, created elaborate outdoor performances featuring real cowboys, Native Americans, and frontier characters, performing scripted versions of Western life. These shows toured across America and Europe, introducing millions of people to a romanticized version of the frontier. Cody's shows featured staged elements that would become Western movie staples: mock battles between cavalry and Indians, demonstrations of sharpshooting, and displays of cowboy skills like roping and riding. Audiences loved the excitement, but they were watching entertainment designed to thrill rather than educate. Dime novels of the late 1800s and early 1900s further mythologized Western figures. Writers like Ned Buntline created fictional adventures for real people like Buffalo Bill, Wild Bill Hickok, and Annie Oakley that were far more dramatic than their actual lives. These cheap publications reached massive audiences and established many of the character types and plot devices that later appeared in Western movies. Early Hollywood eagerly adopted these established myths because they provided ready-made stories with proven audience appeal. Silent westerns like The Great Train Robbery, 1903, and Hell's Hinges, 1916, established visual conventions, dusty streets, saloon brawls, cavalry charges that defined the genre. The studio system of the 1930s and 1940s mass-produced Western movies using standardized formulas. Studios like Republic Pictures and Monogram churned out hundreds of B-westerns, featuring singing cowboys, heroic sheriffs, and evil outlaws. These films prioritized entertainment value over historical accuracy. Major stars like John Wayne, Gary Cooper, and Randolph Scott became identified with Western roles that reinforced mythological versions of frontier masculinity. Their screen personas, stoic, individualistic, quick with a gun, became templates for how Americans imagined their ancestors. Television westerns of the 1950s and 1960s brought these myths into American homes on a weekly basis. Shows like Gunsmoke, Bonanza, and The Lone Ranger reached enormous audiences and reinforced Hollywood's version of Western history through countless episodes. The economic incentives for perpetuating these myths were substantial. Western movies and TV shows were profitable, Western-themed tourism brought money to communities, and Western imagery became valuable for advertising everything from cigarettes to pickup trucks. These myths also served psychological and cultural functions for American society. The frontier story provided a narrative of national achievement, individual heroism, and manifest destiny that supported American confidence and exceptionalism. The myths offered simple moral frameworks, good versus evil, civilization versus wilderness, that appealed to audiences seeking clear-cut heroes and villains. The impact of Wild West mythology extends far beyond entertainment. These fictional narratives have profoundly influenced American politics, culture, and identity in ways that continue to shape our society today. American political rhetoric regularly employs Western imagery and metaphors. Politicians position themselves as sheriffs cleaning up corruption, promise to ride into Washington like frontier heroes, and invoke the independent spirit of the Old West. This language resonates with voters partly because Western myths have trained Americans to see these frontier archetypes as inherently virtuous. The mythology of rugged individualism that emerged from Western stories has influenced American attitudes toward government, social welfare, and community responsibility. The mythical cowboy who succeeds through personal effort and self-reliance became a template for American ideals, even though real frontier life required extensive cooperation and mutual support. Gun rights debates often invoke Wild West imagery, with both sides using frontier metaphors to support their positions. Supporters of gun rights point to the armed citizen heroes of Western movies, while gun control advocates cite the actual historical evidence that frontier towns typically had strict weapons regulations. American foreign policy has frequently employed Western-style rhetoric, particularly the concept of bringing law and order to lawless territories. Presidents from Theodore Roosevelt to Ronald Reagan to George W. Bush have used cowboy imagery to explain American international interventions. The environmental movement has had to contend with Western mythology that portrays the frontier as an endless source of resources waiting to be exploited by enterprising individuals. This perspective, while historically inaccurate, has influenced American attitudes toward land use, resource extraction, and conservation. Tourism industries across the American West have built economies around maintaining and promoting Western myths. Ghost towns, dude ranches, Western-themed festivals, and historical reenactments generate billions of dollars annually while reinforcing fictional versions of history. Popular culture continues to perpetuate these myths through video games, novels, music, and fashion. Country music, in particular, has adopted Western imagery and values even though most country musicians have no connection to actual frontier life. The myths have also influenced how Americans understand concepts like freedom, justice, and national character. The frontier story suggests that American values emerged naturally from the Western experience, when in reality, these values were complex products of multiple cultural, economic, and political influences. Marketing and advertising regularly use Western imagery to sell products by associating them with frontier virtues like authenticity, toughness, and independence. Everything from pickup trucks to beef jerky to political candidates gets marketed using cowboy symbolism. These persistent myths have made it difficult for Americans to understand the actual complexity and diversity of their historical experience. The simplified Western narrative has overshadowed other important stories about immigration, industrialization, urbanization, and cultural change that were equally significant in shaping American society. So what was life really like on the American frontier? Let's explore the genuine experiences of the people who actually lived through this transformative period in American history. Most frontier settlers were farmers, not cowboys. They came west seeking fertile land where they could establish family farms and build stable communities. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered 160 acres of free land to anyone willing to live on and improve it for 5 years, attracting hundreds of thousands of families seeking economic opportunities. Daily life was dominated by the practical challenges of establishing homes, farms, and communities in areas with limited infrastructure. Settlers had to build their own houses, dig wells, clear fields, plant crops, and create the basic necessities of life largely through their own labor and cooperation with neighbors. Women's work was essential to frontier survival and included cooking, cleaning, childcare, gardening, textile production, food preservation, medical care, and often helping with farm work. Many women also contributed to family income through activities like taking in laundry, selling eggs and butter, or providing services to other community members. Children on the frontier typically had responsibilities that would seem heavy by modern standards. They helped with farming, animal care, household tasks, and often worked to contribute to family income. However, most frontier communities established schools relatively quickly because education was seen as essential for future prosperity. Social life centered around family, neighbors, and community institutions. People gathered for barn raisings, harvest celebrations, church services, school programs, and seasonal festivals. These events were crucial for maintaining social bonds and providing mutual support in challenging environments. Economic relationships were more diverse than Hollywood suggests. While some communities were based on cattle ranching or mining, most frontier economies included agriculture, small manufacturing, commerce, and professional services. Successful communities developed diversified economies that could weather downturns in specific industries. Technology adoption was often rapid because frontier communities couldn't afford to ignore innovations that could improve productivity or quality of life. Railroads, telegraph lines, modern agricultural equipment, and industrial machinery reached frontier areas surprisingly quickly when they offered clear economic advantages. Conflict resolution typically occurred through legal institutions, community pressure, and negotiation rather than violence. Most frontier communities established formal justice systems early in their development because law and order were essential for attracting settlers and investment. Cultural diversity was a defining characteristic of many frontier communities. Different ethnic groups, religious denominations, and regional backgrounds created complex social dynamics that required constant negotiation and accommodation. The frontier experience was temporary for most communities. Successful settlements quickly developed the institutions, infrastructure, and economic systems that connected them to the broader American society. The frontier phase typically lasted only a few years before communities became integrated into national networks. Understanding why these Wild West myths developed and persisted reveals important insights about how societies create and maintain historical narratives that serve contemporary needs rather than historical accuracy. The timing of when these myths emerged is crucial to understanding their purpose. The romanticization of the Wild West began in the 1880s and 1890s, just as the frontier period was ending and America was undergoing rapid industrialization and urbanization. As Americans moved to cities and worked in factories, they nostalgically idealized the supposedly simpler, more heroic frontier life they were leaving behind. This nostalgia served psychological functions for a society experiencing rapid change. The Western myths provided stability and continuity by suggesting that American character had been forged in the frontier experience. They offered reassurance that despite industrial modernization, Americans retained the virtues of their pioneering ancestors. The myths also served nationalist purposes by creating a uniquely American story that differentiated the United States from European nations. While Europeans could claim ancient cultural traditions, Americans could point to the frontier experience as their distinctive historical achievement. The Western story became part of American exceptionalism, the belief that America was fundamentally different from and superior to other nations. Economic interests played a major role in promoting and maintaining these myths. Entertainment industries profited from Western stories, tourism businesses capitalized on Western imagery, and politicians used frontier rhetoric to advance their careers. These groups had financial incentives to maintain fictional versions of Western history regardless of historical accuracy. The myths provided simple moral frameworks that appealed to audiences seeking clear distinctions between good and evil. Western stories typically featured heroic individuals triumphing over obvious villains through personal courage and moral conviction. These narratives were more satisfying than the complex, ambiguous realities of actual historical experiences. Racial and cultural factors influenced how the myths developed. By focusing on white male heroes and portraying other groups as either absent or antagonistic, Western myths supported existing power structures and social hierarchies. They provided historical justification for contemporary inequalities by suggesting that white Americans had earned their dominant position through frontier heroism. The myths became self-perpetuating through repetition across multiple media and generations. Each new version of Western stories drew on previous versions, gradually moving further from historical reality, while becoming more entrenched in popular consciousness. Eventually, the fictional versions became more familiar and emotionally compelling than actual history. Educational systems inadvertently reinforced these myths by failing to teach the complex realities of frontier history. School textbooks often repeated simplified Western stories without providing the context necessary to understand their historical inaccuracy. The myths persist today, partly because they continue to serve contemporary psychological and political needs. They provide Americans with a heroic national origin story and support cultural values like individualism and self-reliance that remain important in American society. As we conclude our journey through the real and mythical Wild West, it's worth reflecting on what these discoveries tell us about history, memory, and the stories societies tell themselves. The gap between Wild West reality and mythology demonstrates how powerfully entertainment can shape historical understanding. When fictional narratives are more exciting, accessible, and emotionally satisfying than complex historical realities, the fiction often wins in popular consciousness. This pattern isn't unique to American Western history. Societies throughout the world have created mythological versions of their past that serve contemporary needs rather than historical accuracy. Understanding how and why these myths develop can help us think more critically about the stories we tell ourselves about our own history and culture. The persistence of Wild West myths also reveals the importance of who gets to tell historical stories and for what purposes. Hollywood's version of the frontier largely erased the experiences of women, minorities, and ordinary families, while emphasizing the adventures of white male heroes. This selective storytelling had real consequences for how Americans understood their heritage and identity. Recognizing the complexity and diversity of actual frontier experience enriches our understanding of American development. The real story includes struggles and achievements of many different groups of people who built communities, adapted to challenging environments, and created the foundations of modern Western states. The economic, social, and cultural achievements of actual frontier settlers were often more impressive than the fictional heroics of movie cowboys. Building sustainable communities in challenging environments required cooperation, innovation, and persistence that deserve recognition and respect. Modern Americans can learn from both the realities and myths of the frontier experience. The cooperation, diversity, and community building that characterized actual frontier life offer valuable lessons for contemporary challenges. At the same time, understanding how and why societies create appealing but inaccurate historical narratives can help us think more critically about the stories we encounter today. The ongoing popularity of Western imagery in American culture suggests that these myths continue to serve psychological and cultural functions. Rather than simply dismissing them, we can appreciate their cultural significance while maintaining awareness of their historical limitations. Preserving and sharing accurate frontier history remains important work for historians, educators, and cultural institutions. Every museum exhibit, documentary film, and educational program that presents the complex realities of frontier experience helps counter the oversimplified myths that have dominated popular understanding. The story of how Wild West myths developed and spread also provides insights into how information travels and transforms in modern media environments. The same processes that turned frontier reality into Hollywood fiction continue to operate today, shaping how we understand current events and contemporary issues. Finally, this exploration reminds us that history is always more interesting, complex, and humanly meaningful than the simplified stories we tell about it. The real American frontier was a place where diverse groups of people worked to build new lives and communities under challenging circumstances. A story of human determination and creativity that deserves to be told accurately and remembered respectfully.